anybody has any questions about the field of international relations or NGOs, or specifically kind of how do you start working in the US NGO sector, I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one. But I think most people here come from a more technical background, so I don't know if that would be of interest. In terms of the topic of discussion today, you've asked me to talk about US NGOs and specifically their role in Egypt. Civil society is a fundamental part of the American system. Since the beginning of the American system, there has always been civil society, maybe not known as non-governmental organizations, but civil society in the broadest sense. We've always valued the idea of an independent media, of political pluralism, political parties, of universities, education, faith-based organizations, churches, mosques. This is part of an integral part of our society, and it's a very valuable entities that help organize people and help bring them around common issues, to work together around common issues, common interests, common priorities. So, even if you go back and read, some of the fundamental literature on, the American democratic system, or even American democracy, like Tocqueville talked about the important role of civil society in America. So it's a very fundamental part of how we operate as a society. And I think for those of you who lived in the US, whether you know it or not, all of you have in some way or another participated in civil society activities. As you mentioned, now more people are going to think tank centers. That's one form of civil society. Many people are involved in philanthropic or charitable organizations. If you're Muslim and you pay zakah, that goes often to a charitable organization that is civil society. So it is very much a part of our day-to-day life here, whether you're cognizant of it or not. Here in the U.S., there's over 1.5 million NGOs. Civil society is a much broader umbrella, and within that, since I'm asked to talk specifically about NGOs, I'll speak specifically about NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations. And these are community organizations often started by groups of like-minded individuals that have a specific agenda or a specific mission that they want to accomplish. And that includes everything from small community-based organizations that are working on things like animal rights or child neglect and abuse or environmental protection, to organizations that are working on a much larger scale. Also, I recently read statistics that there are about 20,000 international organizations, and these are organizations that work globally. And many of these organizations, again, they have a belief that there are certain common universal values, and that they work across countries to support or promote one particular value. Like, for example, human rights organizations, international development organizations, faith-based organizations that are trying to alleviate poverty or to advocate for better environmental policies. So you have such a wide range of different organizations, and they play a very, very important role both within any particular country as well as on the global scale. Looking specifically at the role of U.S. organizations and what they do in Egypt, I don't have a number of exactly how many American organizations work in Egypt, but there's quite a few. Obviously, most of you probably have heard about the NGO trial, and that focused specifically on the democracy organizations. And I'll talk to you a bit more specifically about that. But from a bigger picture, these organizations provide a number of different services. Number one, they provide technical assistance. So, and Egypt, as a country that has a very rich history and civilization, has in the past been very critical in providing expertise around the world. And international organizations also provide that. And it's not limited to any one particular country. All countries have their organizations that provide technical expertise and support to different parts of the world. And again, most of the international organizations that are American, they don't focus, or they're not targeting Egypt specifically. Sure, there are some specific bilateral organizations. You have diaspora organizations such as this one. You have organizations such as, many of you may be familiar with Hands Along the Nile, which does specific development work for Egypt. So there are some groups that focus specifically on Egypt, but for the most part, a lot of these international organizations work on a global level. And the benefit from them is they provide a global perspective. One of the accusations you often hear about American organizations is that they're pushing a particular American vision or a particular American agenda. But in reality, at least from the organizations that I've worked with, the beauty of these organizations is that they have an umbrella view of examples from all over the world, contacts from all over the world. So, in my past, I worked for Internews Network, which did media development, and they had trainers, expertise, examples from media development around the world, and that's critical. Like that, sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Bringing together experts that have had experience in different countries helps us see things in a different way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to impose their way, and it doesn't necessarily mean that their way is right for the context of Egypt, but it is education. When we read history, when we study at universities, you don't learn about specific cases. You have a broader view, and then you take what works for you, and you don't take what doesn't work for you. So one important role that these organizations play is providing technical expertise, sharing best practices, providing models, examples from all over the world. So that's one area where these organizations are critical. Another area where they're critical is, especially in the case of policy centers, as you mentioned, policy centers are very critical in shaping policy. And again, these run the gambit. They are, you have all kinds of perspectives of these think tanks. Even here in Washington, you'll find think tanks that have a very kind of left of center perspective, some that have a right of center perspective, and many of them, they're if you follow them closely, you know which slant they take. So again, there's this idea, and I keep hearing this from Egyptians, is that there's this monolith, this masked conspiracy that's trying to push Egypt in one way. It's just not how American society works. All of these organizations have different views, different positions, different different takes on situations in Egypt and other parts of the world. So, but the think tanks are very much critical in helping to shape policy here in Washington. Policy tanks are also, policy centers and think tanks are also very important in the sense that you may have heard the saying or the term revolving door, especially here in Washington. There's many people who come from government, enter think tanks, or start in think tanks and enter government. So they play a very important role in both supplying policymakers and also bringing policymakers back to speak more independently on policy issues. So that's another area where they're very critical. Again, we talked about technical expertise, we talked about policy influence. Assistance, again, on the development side, a lot of these international organizations provide much needed development assistance. Many of them will provide equipment for medical purposes, or in countries where there's severe poverty, they'll help provide nutrition or food, or if, for example, you have organizations like Reporters Without Borders, which provide safety equipment for journalists working in conflict zones. So they also play a role in providing assistance, especially to places that have a need for actual either material or financial support. You also have the donors and the financial institutions and the grant makers, and they provide financial assistance to non-governmental or even governmental organizations around the world. So you have a very wide range of different organizations that play different roles. I think one thing that we're seeing here, and I think Dr. Safai just mentioned that, we are seeing a lot more Egyptians playing these roles. And I know when I first wanted to study international relations, my parents didn't really understand that. They, in our culture, we prefer people to go into the technical fields. It's more secure. Engineering, medicine, that's something that's more, it's more sustainable, it's more concrete. But I think it's very important to encourage more Egyptian Arab Americans to be involved in civic and political activism as well, because they're going to be a very important link to help bridge between the differences in the Middle East and the Arab world with the policy here. And I think there needs to be a lot of work on that level. And the beauty of it now, even when over the past several years, I know many different Egyptians that are in many of these different organizations, and many of them are there because they want to support their homeland and do something for the country of their origin, and also bridge the divide between U.S. and the Middle East, and help improve cultural and cross-cultural understanding between the two different communities and societies.
Is there any difference between Egyptians and other Arabs?
Are there differences?
Difference, yeah. Do you see that, like, we know that the Palestinians are everywhere.
Yeah.
They are very active in that. Are Egyptians similar, or?
I think I've seen a mix of everything. Like when I worked at the NED, we had several Iraqis, we had several Egyptians, we had several Palestinians, we had a few Jordanians. So it was really a mix. I haven't seen, I mean, I think the Lebanese and the Palestinian, because they were the